So, all right, without further ado, I'm going to bring on Rummana Hussain, a dear friend of the show, editorial writer and columnist extraordinaire for the Chicago Sun-Times. Welcome back, Rummana.
Thanks for having me again.
All right, your thoughts on Donald Trump openly saying he doesn't have to, finding his inner Napoleon. Okay, let's just pause and think about that, Rummana. He loves French fries, and don't call them freedom fries. Finding his inner Napoleon and saying he doesn't have to abide by judicial rulings. Your thoughts, as someone who covered the criminal justice building for years and years and years, where judges reign. Go ahead.
That's interesting that he says that, because then he paints certain immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, as criminals. So is he saying crime, like he's saying crime is okay for him or for not for other people? That's what he's basically saying. I mean, are you really shocked that he's saying something like this? This is someone who, I think it was before the 2016 presidential election, he said that, people love him so much. And, he might be true about the quote, the quote that he said back then, that people like him so much that if he shot someone in Manhattan, that wouldn't matter and he'd still get elected president. He definitely incited, I think a lot of people would argue, incited the January 6th riots, but, he pretty much has gotten a pass, and he is, I know we can't, a lot of people say you shouldn't use the word felon anymore or call someone a felon, but he has been convicted of felonies. So, he's committed crimes, and, when you're able to, pardon, I guess not pardon yourself, but when you have a Department of Justice that is going to be told that you cannot, hold the president accountable. I mean, he's basically allowed to do whatever he wants. And the thing is, we don't know how long this is going to go on. The sad thing is that a lot of people in this country, I still think, don't agree with what is happening. The question is, there's still a lot of people who do agree or are at least okay with what he's doing. So it's like, I don't know how long this can be sustained for him to do whatever he wants and no checks and balances. There's something's going to give, or I don't know whether it's going to be something that, the people in the streets are going to be like calling out, or, actual political opponents, whether things are going to be held in court. But I just don't think that he can not be held accountable for that long. I mean, it's very possible that it will be for a long time before it happens, but I don't know. I try to be hopeful, but hearing him say things like that and not being held accountable, it does make me wonder how much he's going to get away with and for how long, and whether this is just going to be the way things are for the next 4 years and in the near future.
All right, so let me throw this one at you. And you tend to have a more benevolent attitude about my fellow Americans, our fellow Americans, than I do. I've noticed that over our many years of talking. I'm a little more jaded about definitely Chicagoans than you are, but Americans in general, I think. So the essence of American democracy, as enshrined in the Constitution, is a separation of power. And we don't have a tyrant. We don't have a king. There's no monarch that rules this country. There's a rule of law, and that president must abide by the rulings of judicial rulings. That goes back to like the early days. Okay, the founding fathers. I call them fathers because there were no mothers in that group. And Donald Trump is essentially saying he's ripping that up. He doesn't have to follow the rulings of judges. He can do whatever he wants. As I said at the opening, even Daley never said that here in Chicago. Do you believe that the American public is by and large indifferent to what that means? In other words, they don't have a concept of separation of powers. They don't believe a president, if they agree with the president, should be bound by a judicial ruling. They believe a president should be able to violate a judicial ruling if he wants to, if he thinks it's in his interest or the country's interest to do so. Do you think most Americans agree with Donald Trump on that position? Go.
I think 50% do. He obviously won the election, so the majority of people who voted are okay with it or agree with it. I think they knew what they were going to get with Donald Trump this time. I guess the excuse for people who voted for him in 2016 was that, you know, they didn't know what he was about or what he meant, and they're trying to shake things up. And I think whoever voted, I think among the voters, and, you know, we have to remember not everybody in this country votes. And a lot of people were upset this election. They didn't think both either option, neither Kamala Harris nor Donald Trump really, they were upset, both candidates. And whether you agree or disagree, there were some people who sat home. I think those people aren't necessarily Trump supporters. And just anecdotally, like the letters to editors that we get at the Sun-Times, most of them are not in favor of what Donald Trump is doing. And it's across the board, like racial, you know, ethnicity, age. There's a lot of people who are like, you know, I'm 86 years old and I cannot believe what's happening to our country. I witnessed this part of history. And they talk about how terrible it is. We do have some people who are in support of Trump, but those are usually in the vocal minority. And a lot of those letter writers, you know, complain about their letters not being printed, but a lot of their letters are either not like in full form sentences, or, you know, sometimes there's certain words that they're using that we can't really use. So they're kind of hard to edit. So I printed some, you know, letters that have said that they're Trump's, you know, support Trump. I try to look for some ones once in a while that, you know, make sense. But I'm just saying anecdotally, most people who are writing to us are really worried and do not agree with what Donald Trump is doing. Of course, we live in a city like Chicago or, you know, the Chicago area, because we're not just getting letters from people from Chicago. There's like the nearby suburbs. People are writing from us there too. But people are upset, and, you know, they're saying all kinds of things, you know, about Elon Musk. They're saying stuff about JD Vance. And so even now, it's like every day, I think most people are writing about Donald Trump, you know, and that's pretty much makes sense, because that has been pretty much the news, even in Chicago, because what happens nationally affects people locally. So I think there are a lot of people, more than we'd like, that think it's okay for the president to do whatever they want, you know, and that means breaking the law and not following the Constitution. But I think there's an equal amount of people that don't agree with it either. And that's why I think something's gonna happen. I mean, I don't know if it's gonna be like, you know, dissent in terms of, you know, just people coming together, protesting in the streets. You know, I think it's just going to be a combination of things. Maybe it won't be, but I think there's going to be some sort of outcry. Something's going to happen. I just don't think that the way Donald Trump has been operating for the last few weeks since the inauguration is going to go on for too long, or it could. I'm not saying it can't, but I think there's just going to be, at some point, there's going to be some sort of pushback that's visible and tangible.
Well, I'm gonna push back on a couple things you said. Number one, I do this with all my guests now. A majority of people did not vote for Donald Trump. He got a plurality. He's under 50%. I always point this out. He did not.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Billy Clinton, he's just like Billy Clinton. Clinton never got a majority of voters. He always got a plurality of voters, because Ross Perot was in that race. And I always argue that Clinton would never have won. I always argue this, Rummana. The whole premise of guys like Rahm, strategists for Clinton, who always say, "Oh, this is what Democrats should do. It worked for Bill Clinton." I always point out, you know, Bill Clinton never won a majority of the voter in this country. I'm just saying, people. Ross Perot wasn't in the race; he wouldn't have won. As for the letter writers, I have noticed. As you know, I read the letters to the editor of the Bright One. I do, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a Bright One, and the New York Times. I find the letters to the editor very helpful in many ways, like just quote unquote, well, I don't want to call them ordinary citizens, because there's nothing ordinary about them, but sometimes they get to the heart of something I believe in. I'm like, yeah, that's a good one. And every now and then I read a letter, it's like, it's so outrageous. I'm like, dude, where did you get this idea? But it's good for me to be exposed to it, is what I'm saying, Rummana. So I appreciate letters to the editor. And so I'm just going to say, I don't know how indicative they are of the general population. I believe anyone, even if they use if they're ungrammatical or they're talking babbling. Anyone who writes a letter to the editor, by and large, is more sophisticated than a quote unquote average citizen. I got that in quotes, because they're engaging.
Yes.
They're engaging in ideas. So I always put them at a higher level of sophistication. And there was one, I think it was today. This is an example where I just, oh boy, I forget where he was from. I don't want to bother naming his name. So he was opining about the federal cuts in the workforce, and he was saying, I've been fired in my life. I feel for you, but man it up. And then he was saying we have this huge deficit, Rummana, and so we have to deal with this deficit. I'm like, dude, those employees that he just fired at the Federal Aviation Administration that like help land planes. First, if we have a $36 billion deficit or whatever the deficit is, the last thing I want to see used to bring down the deficit like a quarter of an inch, Rummana, is somebody who's helping land planes and planes to take off without a crash. It's like, sometimes I'll read a letter to the editor having just said all that. I'm like, what planet are you on? There is no logic to what you're saying. Oh, we have a huge deficit. Let's get rid of the people who land planes. So I have trouble with the letter writers, but I don't know if I see them as a hopeful sign necessarily.
Yeah, you're right. You're right for sure. Speaking of the FAA, my oldest nephew works for the FAA. He just got a job with them a few months ago, so he's a probationary worker. Yesterday when they announced the layoffs, I checked with him. He's okay. He's an engineer, but he did say people he knows. I think he knows about the layoffs. Obviously, he works in the FAA. But as soon as I got the news story, I asked him if he was okay, and he said he was fine. But his anything could happen with his job too. And yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't know. I mean, I think the last few weeks has been very nobody. I think the word hopeful is not the right answer. The way is the right thing to say with the way people are feeling. A lot of people who don't support Trump, most people are just feeling overwhelmed. People are talking about wanting to take news breaks, and I get that. I want to stay engaged, just as someone who's a journalist, and I do appreciate letter writers. I do. There's some people who write like us every day. We have a rule where we try to keep one letter a month, like from a certain person, because we want to, have like all kinds of people speaking. We don't want to have the same letter writers over and over again. But there's some people who write to us all the time, and so they're really into it, and they are paying attention. So yeah, I think you're right. Maybe I'm just being too hopeful. There's some days where I'm more hopeful than others, and some days I'm not. And so I think a lot of people, the feeling of uncertainty and the feeling of despair is just kind of like lingering in the air for a lot of people.
Yeah, the concept of news breaks is an interesting concept. Both of us are news junkies, and you've been in the news business since your 20s. Early 20s, so you've quite a life. This is what you do. So the concept of a news break is something I don't really fully understand. But last night I was at bowling, and a couple guys, shout out Jeff, shout out Jason, and they were telling me, or Jeff was telling me he's not following the news as closely as before. It's overwhelming and it's upsetting, etc., and so forth. So I suppose on some level, I get that. No, I do get that. Like, for instance, on a totally not serious front, if my beloved Bulls are doing badly, I'm not going to follow them as closely as when they're doing well, because I just don't want to read articles about how bad they're doing. So I guess I understand the overall concept. But I've been following the news as closely as I ever have. I'm just fascinated by what's going on and afraid by what's going on. So I don't. It's a little foreign or alien to me, the concept of taking a news break at a time of so much disaster. I will say this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I'm having a harder and harder time finding Chicago news relevant. And I'll give you an example. We made fun of it so much last week on Oh What a Week, but the whole controversy, I have it in quotes, about the gift room in City Hall, and where they stashed like the cufflinks and shoes that people gave Mayor Brandon Johnson. I guess Mayor Lori Lightfoot, some of her stuff was up there too as well. Was treated, Rummana, as though it was a major significant matter. And I'm looking at it in the context of what's going on in our country right now, where Donald Trump is basically just ordering the Justice Department to drop its case against Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, that Donald Trump is essentially shaking down Facebook for donations to his presidential library, and in turn he'll drop his lawsuit against them. Donald Trump is meeting with Saudi officials so that he can bring their golf tour to his golf courses. Just open displays of, I don't know what, graft, shakedowns. And I'm supposed to be worried about somebody who gives a painting to the mayor, which the mayor immediately puts in a room in City Hall. I find it harder to take serious the news coming out about Chicago. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think those stories are important too, but I know what you're saying. Like, it's kind of like, okay, not to say, but the thing is, like, I guess, do you not cover something like that? You definitely want to cover something like that. But I think you're saying, like, it shouldn't get the attention, or like it shouldn't be the front page headline every day or anything like that.
Well, I think if you cover it, you should put it in the context of what's going on in our country.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. Like, oh, this is happening. You know what I mean? Because there's definitely, like, again, like, we've had this conversation many times, like criticizing, the mayor, Brandon Johnson, is legitimate. Like, that's what the news organizations are supposed to be doing. But whether, there are times where the criticism is unfair or there's no context attached to it. So no, I agree. Like, you look at, you got to look at the whole picture, kind of like pull back, it's kind of like a camera. You pull back on everything that's happening. I do think that what is happening nationally does affect us locally. So, a lot of people are saying, like, oh, well, that's national news, but everything, I think Chicago is a target for Donald Trump, and it's something that we have to pay attention to. So no, I think you have a point. I think you have to look at the context. But that doesn't mean we don't cover, and I know you're not saying that. I think we still have to keep covering. You're just saying it's low hanging fruit. That's what is that what you're kind of saying?
I'm saying on many fronts. The concept that there's something horrific about a room in City Hall filled with junk that people gave the mayor. Okay, the cufflinks were not junk, but they're in the room, so he's not wearing them. It's first of all, it's kind of funny. It's so indicative of Chicago. It's so Chicago that when the mayor comes, you feel compelled to give him a gift. That's like, it's like he works for you. You don't have to give him a gift because he showed up. But that's a very Chicago thing. Rummana, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for coming here. We love you, Mr. Mayor. Here, take my cufflinks, please. So it's like a very Chicago thing. So I think it's kind of funny. But I feel like if you report on it and give it such urgency, what you're inflating it and hyping it, and it's irresponsible to report on it without talking about what is happening in our country as a whole. Like, we're making a big deal about cufflinks and shoes and paintings when Donald Trump just shook down Meta for how many? I forget, 15 million. I always forget them. I get that mixed up with the amount he shook down Disney for dropping the lawsuit against George Stephanopoulos' show. So you follow what I'm saying? And then the Madigan. I could love your thoughts on this as a person who's covered courts. Like, Madigan is convicted by a jury. How can you not report that immediately and write about Donald Trump ordering corruption charges against Eric Adams to be dropped? Donald Trump
or Rod Blagojevich, right? He got pardoned the same week, I believe. I don't know if it was the same
It
day,
was.
but was it? But you know, Rich Miller actually, who writes for Capital Facts, he wrote about that, like how this is kind of like a movie script. So like, you know, Madigan always thought Rod Blagojevich was corrupt, and you know, here we have Michael Madigan being convicted, and then you know, we have Rod Blagojevich being pardoned uh, by Donald Trump. And then, you know, he also might be the ambassador of Serbia. So he's like, here's someone who, like, you know, was getting pardoned for a crime. And then he ends up then we don't know if it's going to happen, but it could. It's very possible, right? We already have Jared Kushner's father being the nominee for the French ambassador. And he is also someone who was convicted of a crime, but also pardoned by Donald Trump. So, yeah, no, I think you do have to talk about that, right? Because that's what happened. That's what is happening. You know, you're having people convicted on one end, and then other people being pardoned, or kind of getting not even getting a slap on the wrist, kind of just being told like that's fine. And what message does that send to the United States, like, or to people, like to kids? I wonder, like, as a child, like, what are you thinking? Like, I have nephews and nieces on my side, and there's nephews and nieces on Mick's side. They're about like they're like 14. You know, some of them are 14 to 16 years old. And when they were all born, Barack Obama was president. And, you know, they remember Barack Obama. And then all of a sudden they have Donald Trump. And you got to be wondering, like, I mean, I asked them what they're thinking and stuff. And it's just, I'm just thinking, just as a child, this must be so kind of crazy, right? Like, you, like, what are they, like, what lessons are children learning, you know, when you have a president who's someone who's convicted of crimes, and he's just doing whatever he wants? And not to say that our past presidents have been perfect, or, but I felt like there's like you know, a cult like following that Donald Trump has that I've never seen before. I don't remember anybody wearing the gear for George Bush. I don't remember, or Ronald Reagan. Like, maybe you would see a little someone wearing a pin or something like that, but like baseball hats, and, like, you know, flashy, like, little, like, shirts. And it's really crazy to see. And no, I just don't know what's going to happen in this country, but
I'll tell you the
I think it's gonna get worse before it gets better.
uh, oh God, wow. You're probably right. I'll tell you the lesson. This is the lesson that any sharp kid will pick up on. And the lesson is this: that in this day and age, at this moment in time, there is no objective right or wrong. There is no objective moral or immoral. There is no objective crime or non-crime. It all is based on the whim of Donald Trump. If he says it's a crime, it's a crime. If he says it's not a crime, they'll drop charges. That's the lesson. The lesson is that you can't objectively, on your own, evaluate whether Michael Madigan committed a crime, whether Eric Adams committed a crime, whether Blago committed a crime. And it's all based on what Donald Trump says. And if Donald Trump says it's not a crime, then no crime took place. So I think that's the lesson. The lesson is that might is right. And if you have the might, then you're right. And everybody else has to fall in line. And when I look at MAGA, when I look at Republicans in this state, Rummana, I just, like, I'm filled with such a sense of, I know what you would say, Ben, are you surprised? But I'm going to say it, disappointment, because I've been listening to Republicans rail against the Democratic machine and its abuses for years, and they don't have a word to say about what Donald Trump is doing. Not one word. They're just cowards, and they won't even acknowledge that Donald Trump shook down Meta. Okay, you know what I mean? And or ESPN. They won't acknowledge that at all, even though Donald Trump is kind of openly bragging about it. So that, to me, is what the lesson is. Your thoughts?
Yeah. No. I agree. I mean, you can get away with anything, right? If you have the power. And yeah, and that has been the case a lot of times. And I totally agree with you. I mean, Donald Trump didn't happen overnight. You know, this is something that slowly happened. You know, people pointed out that, you know, the conservative justices that are in place right now, that didn't happen overnight. You know, obviously Donald Trump installed some of them, but there were some that were in there before. And this is something that's been kind of happening overnight. And so, yeah, I think that's just a lesson here, which is it's a sad lesson, right? Like, you know, when you're younger, you have all these ideals, just like me being a teenager. And, you know, we had the boomers like kind of thrown in our faces. And, you know, they always talked about the 60s and, you know, the ideals. And so, like, you know, we were fed that. And then you always think like, oh, you know, this is how I feel. And then after a while, you realize like being conscious, like it's having conscience and like having morals doesn't really matter, because you're not going to get ahead. You know, when you have like beliefs and you stand by them, actually a lot of times I'm learning it actually hurts you more than it helps you in this world and in this country. Like, the more you suck up to power, the more you you know, go along with what the powers of be tell you to do, the more you get ahead. And I think this is why I've never really gotten ahead in a lot of things, because I do feel like I stand for stuff. And I don't know if that's helped me in life. It might have hurt me more. But I can't live with myself if I was some another way. I remember I know I talked to my husband Mick about JD Vance and his wife Usha, who is Indian, South Asian. And you know, JD Vance went from a never Trumper to his vice president. And I'm just like, how does this happen? Like, and you know, we've talked about this too. And Mick turns to me and says, you have to understand, these people are not like you and me. But it seems like there's more people like that than not. And so that's what's disappointing to me. And you know, I'm not like, you know, naive. I know how the world works, and I've always known how the world works, but just to see it so blatantly is just so, it's just really like, wow. It's like Donald Trump doesn't like DEI and everybody's scared, so they're getting rid of their DEI initiatives. It's just like, God, what cowards, you know what I mean? And it's like nobody's standing up. So who's going to stand up to Donald Trump if we can't, if people who say they represent the ideals and want to do the right thing can't stand up, then really who is going to stand up?
Yeah.
It's going to be like nobody left standing. Everybody's just going to be like, okay, we'll do whatever you tell us to do. And that's not what we should be seeing. And
Yeah.
so that's what makes me a little less hopeful when I see people cowering. You know, what company isn't getting rid of DI except Costco? They're the only ones who are just standing their ground.
Yeah. Well, it's we've talked so much about DEI in the show, but
Yeah.
essentially DEI is just a code word for Black people. And that's how it's like this great counter revolution in this country. Wow, we're finally able to say we're not a racist country. We're finally able to say we don't need these initiatives. We're finally able to be free and liberated from our past as we erase our history. Yeah, and you're right. Corporations are going along with it. I fully expect the pressure on baseball. I've said this so many times on the mic, to get rid of Jackie Robinson Day, which is a day every, I think it's in April, where all the baseball players wear the number 42, Jackie Robinson's number, to honor his legacy. Well, if you take DEI, anti-DEI initiatives to the fullest extent, which is where they want us to, then you get rid of that, because that's acknowledging something that Donald Trump says we shouldn't acknowledge, which is that we have a racist past, and that Jackie Robinson's being honored because he had the courage to defy it openly. So I'm watching that one, Rummana.